Self-care isn't selfish. Not doing it is. If you're not looking after you, how can you possibly show up for your child? In today's society, our kids need us 110%. In reality, the best they'll probably ever get is around 70 to 80%. If you're not looking after you, you can expect that to drop down to around 40 or 50%. Now, I know this is a brutal thing to say, but we really need to smash this mother martyr myth. The idea that the perfect mother is a woman who puts everybody before herself. Because in this topsy-turvy way, the actual fact is if you're not looking after you, then you're not looking after your child either. Now, I have experienced this directly and been very, very guilty of it. When I first became a parent, I really struggled to cope. My daughter wasn't sleeping, so I wasn't sleeping either. And I could tell that her development wasn't typical, but I was really struggling to get anyone to listen to me, and the professionals who were supposed to be helping me simply weren't. And I felt very isolated and alone, and I just wasn't taking any breaks either. It was just full on, nearly 24 hours a day because she wasn't sleeping. So the outcome of this was that I developed very significant emotional difficulties, which did eventually blow up into a full-scale mental health crisis. I was crying all the time. I was, as I said, I wasn't sleeping, and I started to notice things like I was having problems with my memory. I was forgetting appointments, and I just didn't really know what was going on from one minute to the next. And it also developed into physical health problems. So I developed stomach issues. I mean, I thought I had some kind of stomach disorder, and I was busy on Google trying to work out what it was. But I just had constant gastrointestinal issues. And eventually I worked out that it was stress related. I've suffered from migraines for years, but they got significantly worse. So not looking after myself had a very big impact on both my body and my mind. And it wasn't until I started putting myself first occasionally that things got better, not just for me, but my daughter as well. Because during that very difficult time, the impact on her was so noticeable. Her behaviour was worse, her sleeping and eating was worse. There is a direct correlation. Stress is contagious. Studies have shown this, that the emotional state of the mother is replicated in the infant or child. So we really are passing on our feelings to our children if we're not looking after ourselves. Now, I know what you're going to say. I just don't have time for it. Well, it is difficult. I want to acknowledge that. But I also want to say that sometimes you may have to look at reorganising your life a bit. For me, it was a very hard but very necessary decision to change the way I worked. So initially I kind of took some leave when my daughter first came along, but then I thought I'd just go back to my career, and that just wasn't feasible. And I did have a few years where I just didn't work because it was just impossible. And I am working again, but I have to do it in this very moderated way, and that was just something that I had to do. But I think you also need to address that question of I don't have time by actually really reflecting on how you are spending your time. For example, when you do have downtime, what are you doing in that downtime? Are you scrolling through your phone? If you added up all the time that you spend scrolling through your phone and put that together, could you be doing something that is more productive to your well-being? Now, the other thing I think people will say is, I don't know what to do. So I'm going to try and make that a bit easier for you with coming up with 3 tips for self-care for busy mums and dads and anyone else who is caring for a high needs child. So those 3 things are time, talking and tapping. Now, if you're not sure what tapping is, I am going to explain that later, but if you are really eager to find out, there is a link in the description which you can go to for some free tapping resources, but I will go into it a bit later on. So the first one, time. So you need to make space for you. And yes, that could be by putting that phone down and doing something else instead, but it is often going to require you to have a conversation with your partner about them ensuring that you have time. It might be that your partner is the main breadwinner, and that is obviously very important, but the job you do is stressful and challenging in a different way. And I know that because I have done both, and the caring job is way more intense and really requires that downtime. So you're going to have to do some negotiations with them to make sure that you have that time. If you're parenting solo, then you're going to have to look around your support network and see who might be able to step in and help you. If you're in the UK, you might be entitled to short breaks, which allows you to have some of that respite time. If you feel like you really don't have anyone, then think about how you might be able to use time that they're at school. And if you say, well, I can't because I have to work when they're at school, then I would say you need to have a hard look at your work-life balance, because this is not sustainable. There is a good website called Entitled To, which will tell you what benefits you might be able to claim to enable you to cut back on your work hours so that you can have that time for you. And it really is that important, because you're not going to be able to go on. You're going to burn out if you don't do something. And then the question is, what do I do in that time? So I'm a very big advocate of getting out in nature. I always say nature is the earth's best therapist. It's one of the reasons why I got a dog, is just so I have an excuse to go out every day and just get out into the fresh air. Even when it's cold and grey, look out for the small beautiful things of winter, a little robin on a branch, or the first snowdrop in the early part of the year. And just be mindful of what's around you and enjoy what is around you. The other thing is moving. So whether that's getting out in nature, as I just discussed, or maybe it's just having a dance around your kitchen. And if you have some mobility problems, there may be some other ways that you can find to move. There will be lots of videos, I'm sure, on YouTube that will better go into that than I do. But ensuring that you're moving keeps you mentally well as physically well. So the next point is talking. So you need to talk to people. We are by nature social creatures, and it's even more important when you're dealing with very stressful situations, which are almost inevitable when you're looking after a high needs child. Now, for some of you, you might want to go down the therapy route, but doing that through the NHS is incredibly difficult with long waiting lists, and doing it private is expensive. And I would say it isn't necessary. There are other ways that you can do this. For example, you can get peer support. You could do that by talking to some of the other mums that are parenting high needs child at your school, or you could join a parent carer forum. I've made great friendships through those. There's also lots of Facebook groups nowadays. The charity Contact has a Facebook group with people sharing questions and support. And there are also lots of groups for individual conditions. So there will be a group for parents of autistic children, ADHD, Down syndrome. You just do a search on Facebook, you'll find something, I'm sure. And the other alternative to traditional therapy, which I find hugely valuable, is writing. So writing has been shown in studies to have a huge therapeutic input and benefits. And there are lots of different ways that you can do this. You can find some journaling prompts online. There is morning papers, which I originally learned as a creative writing technique, but it's also used for therapeutic value. And the basic idea is you just get up in the morning and you write for 20-30 minutes, whatever comes out of your head. And what I do is I write all my fears and my resentments, and I let rip, because at the end of it I tear it up into tiny pieces and I put it in the bin. I don't read through it, I don't show anyone, I'm just getting it all out. And I do think as parents we should have a space to release those resentments and say all those things that are kind of controversial, that, you know, we shouldn't be saying about our children or our teachers or whoever. Just letting it all rip and then tearing it all up and throwing it in the bin. Now, what I do after my writing, it's not necessary, but I find it's quite useful. When we're writing all our resentments and things like that, you can get a little bit dysregulated. So I just take 20 minutes to meditate after I have written, and I just find that then physically I'm releasing it all from my body as well. So the final suggestion for self-care, as I mentioned before, is tapping. Now, if you haven't heard of tapping before, it is a mix of the Eastern tradition of acupuncture with Western psychotherapy. So what we do is we tap on various parts of our body. These are the points of the body that if you were doing acupuncture, that's where they would put the needles. And while we're tapping, we're reciting various statements, the kind of things that you might hear in a psychotherapy session that you might be using with a therapist. Now, there were only a few studies on this because it's still relatively new. It was only developed in the 80s, but it is gaining in popularity. And those few studies have shown that it's had remarkable impact on Vietnam vets with PTSD. And there is growing anecdotal evidence as well that it has a very immediate and dramatic input on people's well-being. And what I love about it is that it takes less than 10 minutes. And I've actually started using it on my daughter as well before bed. And she actually now asks me for it because she gets very stressed before bed. And so we just take a few minutes together and we do some tapping, and I can literally see her eyelids getting heavy as we're doing it. And she's just a real fan. She thought I was some kind of sorceress when I first did it. She was just like, how did you do that thing? So we find it's a really great way of getting rid of stress. And what I love about it is that I can do it along with her. And so we're both looking after ourselves at the same time. And I also like it because if you have a child who's non-verbal or limited verbal or can speak but just maybe has some speech issues like my daughter, or they have coordination difficulties and can't manage the tapping, you can tap on them. And there is a very wide margin of error as well. So if you don't quite get the tapping points right, it's fine. If you don't do them in the right order, it's fine. And you can also say the statements for them. So my daughter has some speech and language difficulties, so I say them for her. So she just lies in bed and I say the statements, and I encourage her to repeat them in her head. I'm not sure she does, but you know, it doesn't matter. It's having the effect. Now, if you would like to learn more about tapping and maybe give it a go for yourself, I do have some free resources on my website, and you can find a link to those in the description, which is down below. So time, talking and tapping, which you can learn about through these free resources on my website. Give those a go and start looking after you. I hope you enjoyed that video and it's given you some ideas on things you can do for self-care and how you can develop a self-care routine. If you'd like to watch some more of my videos, including perhaps a bit more about tapping, I've got this video here that I think you'll find really useful. It goes into much more depth about tapping, including the science behind it and everything you basically need to know. So give this a click here and get watching.